Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Dr. Adrian Torres. Today, I will be talking with John about bad arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, we know that the resurrection of Jesus is the linchpin of Christianity. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Christianity is false.
Certainly. As we read in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. And if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men the most pitiable. Of course, the passage goes on to say that, but now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep.
Certainly, and you did do a series on the best arguments for the resurrection, and it was certainly convincing. But you did mention that there are some bad arguments for the resurrection. What did you mean by that?
There are some arguments that are frequently brought up by apologists as support for the resurrection, arguments that are fundamentally flawed. Strangely, they tend to be quite popular and are frequently adduced by apologists and lay Christians as well.
Is that a problem?
I would say so. We want our apologetics to be bulletproof. We do not want to present arguments that a knowledgeable skeptic could debunk. It would cast a shadow on all our arguments.
So why do Christians use these arguments?
I think they generally do it in good faith. They've heard the arguments and they seem solid, so they repeat them. But they have not checked them carefully. We need always to do our due diligence, and honesty compels us not to use arguments once we have been shown that they are not valid. And we have more than enough good ones.
Okay, so what are these bad arguments and why are they bad?
There are four in particular that are very often used but are invalid. There's a fifth one, very widespread in academia and now moving into lay apologetics. That one is somewhat technical, and we'll go over that another time in another program. Today, we'll go over the four common ones.
Sure, let's do it. What's the first one?
The first one goes something like this. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, why didn't the Roman or Jewish authorities produce his body when the apostles started preaching the resurrection? They wanted to stop the preaching of the resurrection and could immediately have proven that the claim that Jesus rose was false by producing his body and showing it to the people.
I've heard that many times. At first glance, it looks like a really good argument. One very popular Christian apologist says, this is historical evidence of the highest quality.
As I said, these arguments are very popular and widely used.
What's wrong with it?
Well, let's ask this first. When was Jesus crucified?
On Passover.
When did the apostles begin publicly preaching that Jesus had risen from the dead?
On Pentecost, according to Acts 2.
And what is the length of time between Passover and Pentecost?
50 days, according to Deuteronomy 16, 1-12.
50 days. So 50 days elapsed between the time Jesus was crucified and the time the apostles began to preach the resurrection.
That's true.
Do you think the body of Jesus would have been recognizable and identifiable 50 days after death? What would happen to a body in an unrefrigerated tomb in 50 days? Well, let's see. According to John Nernoff III, a retired pathologist, a face will become nearly unrecognizable after several days at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about the average temperature in Jerusalem for the time period in question. That's from Journal of Higher Criticism, Volume 8, Number 2. Vosh Arpad in Beyond the Grave, Understanding Human Composition, published in Microbiology Today, Volume 28, gives a general formula that indicates that under the conditions in question, the body would actually have skeletonized in about 70 days. Vosh also mentions that injuries affect the rate as well as since damage to the skin increases blood loss, insect and bacterial action, And Jesus' body had been severely mangled by the scourging he'd received, as well as the crucifixion itself. It seems clear, therefore, that his body would not have been recognizable after 50 days. And even Jewish law recognized this fact. According to Midrash Rabbah Genesis 65:20, which is part of their Talmud, you cannot testify to the identity of a corpse save by the facial features together with the nose, even if there are marks of identification in his body and garments. Again, you can testify only within 3 days of death. And then in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Yebamot, folio 120a, evidence of identification may be tendered by those only who saw the corpse within 3 days after death. So, true, these statements are from somewhat later than Jesus' time, but there's no reason to think they had better ways to identify corpses at an earlier time period.
I see the problem. But what about the herbs and the bindings that they applied to Jesus, supposedly 100 pounds of substance in wrapping him up? Wouldn't that preserve the corpse for a longer time? Did they take that into consideration?
Well, what was the purpose of the spices? It actually was not to preserve the body for longer. There was actually no point of preserving the body for longer. The goal actually was to let it completely skeletonize and then put the bones into the little bone box called the ossuary, which would then be stored permanently in the tomb. The actual purpose of the spices was to cover the smell of the rotting flesh. This is why when Jesus went to raise Lazarus, and it was the 4th day, and he wants to bring Lazarus out, and the sisters tell him, in the quaint language of the King James Version, by this time he doth stink. So no, the spices would not preserve him longer. They'd simply cover up the stench. If there was any action to preserve, well, maybe it would go beyond 3 or 4 days, but not 50 days.
What about the bindings? Like the pharaohs all bound into mummies, and then the bodies are preserved thousands of years later.
Well, the bindings are not what preserved the mummies. To preserve the mummies, they went through a very, very careful process in which they removed the internal organs, put them into jars, used various chemicals to try to keep the body from rotting, and then wrap them up. Ironically, the mummies in Egypt were not preserved as well as some of the bodies of ordinary people that were simply flung out into the dry desert sands, where they were preserved just by the extreme dryness. So with all that, and those are good questions, but the problem still remains.
I see the problem.
So here's the point. The authorities had no reason to produce the body of Jesus before the apostles began to preach that Jesus had risen from the dead. And by the time they did start preaching it, it was too late to produce the body. There would have been no point, as there was no way that they could have proven that the mostly skeletonized, rotting piece of flesh they could produce was the body of Jesus. So this argument for the resurrection of Jesus is pointless. Don't use it.
But isn't it possible that the disciples started preaching that Jesus rose before Pentecost? After all, didn't the tomb guards report to the chief priests on the very day Jesus rose? And didn't they get bribed to lie and say that Jesus' disciples had stolen his body while the guards slept?
Yes, that was a particularly stupid lie. It would have been fun to see the first fellow who said to the tomb guards when they said, his disciples stole him away while we were sleeping, have this guy ask him, well, if you were asleep, how do you know what happened? So it was a particularly clumsy sort of lie. But here's the key question for our consideration. When did they start speaking this lie?
Not right away?
No. They certainly would not need to do it until the disciples actually started preaching. They would not want to jump the gun and draw attention to the claim at all if it may never be made. As long as the disciples are not saying Jesus rose, why would they mention that the body had been stolen? Now, the disciples obviously did not start preaching while Jesus was with them, which would be obvious, because then they want to go out and preach and say, Jesus rose from the dead. We're eyewitnesses. They would have said, he's right here. Take a look. So for the 40 days that he was with them, they weren't preaching. And then before he ascended, he told them to stay in Jerusalem until they received the promised Holy Spirit and his power, and this they did. And so it's very evident, as Acts indicates, that they did not start preaching the resurrection of Jesus until Pentecost, and by that time it was too late to offset it by producing the body. So as we said, it's a worthless argument. Let's dispense with it.
I see what you mean by a bad argument for the resurrection. You said there are others. What are they?
Here's one, and I'm sure you've heard this one as well. It goes like this. The disciples could not have stolen the body because Pontius Pilate posted a crack Roman guard for the very purpose of preventing anyone from stealing the body. The soldiers of the guard would have been executed had they fallen asleep on duty, and so they certainly would not have done so. And Jesus' untrained and distraught disciples could not have overpowered armed and trained soldiers. What do you think of that argument?
Well, this one also seems good. What's wrong with it?
Well, here too, it does look good until we look at the timeline of events. Listen to Matthew 27, verses 62 to 66. On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember while he was still alive, how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, command that the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' So the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go your way, make it as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. That's the end of the quote. Now, do you see the problem?
Yes. The tomb wasn't sealed immediately. There was an entire night and several hours of daylight during which the disciples could have stolen the body. But wait, wouldn't the Roman soldiers have made sure the body was in the tomb before they sealed it?
Did they move that huge stone to check that the body was there and had not already been stolen before they sealed the tomb? Maybe, maybe not. But the bigger problem is that the guard was only there till the third day. Remember, public preaching of the resurrection by the disciples began on Pentecost 50 days later. So they had 47 days after the guard left, 47 days during which time the tomb was unguarded, and the body could have been stolen without the need to battle a crack band of Roman soldiers, with no opposition at all, in fact. And that's why it's not a good argument. We can't overlook the time factor again.
Can you explain what you mean by sealing the tomb? I always thought when you roll a big stone so that nobody can roll it out, that's sealing the tomb. But I think you mean something else.
Yes, well, the Roman soldiers would put an official seal, a governmental seal upon the tomb forbidding anyone to open it. So if that seal was broken, they would be committing a capital offense. So sealing and rolling the stone there is not the same thing.
So you mean if someone opened the tomb, roll out the stone, you can see that the seal was broken. Let's say someone rolls it over and rolls it back. Can you tell someone has been there?
Yes, you would be able to tell. So there you go. This is why it's not a good argument. Like the first one, the time factor, which they seem to overlook, the time factor makes it a poor argument.
True. I wonder why our apologists all seem to overlook these facts, which once pointed out seem so obvious.
I don't know. And what I find even more puzzling, though, is why some of them, even after these things are pointed out, want to continue holding on to the arguments. About that first one, that Jesus' body would have not been recognizable, I found a very well-known apologetics ministry using this argument in an article that they posted on their website, and I emailed them about it, pointing out this fact. And the fellow who wrote it refused to accept it. He actually insisted on arguing, say, "Oh, well, maybe, modern times, we can identify dead bodies." He was finally reduced to saying, well, maybe Jesus had some kind of birthmark that could have been used to identify him. So he has to posit a birthmark about which the Bible says nothing. If there was a birthmark, it would be on his skin, and so that would have rotted away. And in point of fact, as we saw in that quote from the Talmud, anything on the body was not acceptable for identification. It had to be the face. So I could not understand why this fellow just insisted on arguing and arguing and arguing. I think we should never be so wedded to our favorite arguments that we're not willing to let them go when they're proven to be invalid. That's the only way to stay bulletproof in apologetics.
What is the third bad argument you want to discuss?
It's this one. The claim that, quote, the majority of scholars, conservative or liberal, agree that the tomb of Jesus was empty. Now, this is part of what is known as the minimal facts approach, and it is supposed to be significant because even liberal scholars agree that the empty tomb is an historical fact.
What's wrong with this argument?
Well, even if it were true that the majority of scholars agree, and that's an open question, I think, but even if it were true that the tomb was empty, that will not convince anyone. The claim that a dead man came back to life is so difficult to accept that just about any other explanation for the empty tomb, even far-fetched ones, would be preferred. And if you don't agree with that, consider this. From John chapter 20, verses 1 to 2. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Do you understand the significance of what she said?
No.
She sees the empty tomb. She doesn't assume, Jesus rose as he said he would. Empty tomb doesn't convince her. She just figures somebody must have taken the body away and we don't know where he put him. She just thinks he's being moved. So Peter and John check out the tomb and they go. And then after that, Jesus actually appears to Mary. And before that, angels. What does it take to convince her? Well, in John 20, 11 to 15, we read, but Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping. And she's already seen it's empty by this time. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, woman, why are you weeping? And listen to her answer. She said to them, because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. She's not happy that he rose from the dead. The empty tomb didn't make her think he rose from the dead. Quite the opposite. She's sad because she thinks somebody took his dead body away. And then we continue the text. Now, when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. You see, she's still not with the program. No matter what, the empty tomb is not going to convince her that Jesus rose from the dead, and she's not the only one. If we look at Luke 24, verses 9 to 12, we read this. Then they, which is the women, then they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. And their words seemed to them like idle tales, and they did not believe them. But Peter arose and ran to the tomb. And stooping down, he saw the linen cloths lying by themselves, and he departed, marveling to himself at what had happened. And then in Luke 24, 19b to 24, where Jesus appears on the road to Emmaus with the two men there, and they said to him, he's asking about what things are going on, and they said to him, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Now notice the use of the past tense there. We were hoping. We used to hope that he was going to. They're no longer hoping, despite the fact that the tomb was empty. They continue. Indeed, besides all this, today is the third day since these things happened. Yes, and certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us. When they did not find his body, they came, saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And certain of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. So here we go. His apostles, Mary Magdalene, his closest followers, those who knew him personally, who spent time with him, who saw his miracles firsthand, if they were not convinced that he rose by an empty tomb, why would we think anyone today would be? Or even then, why did the apostles never appeal to it? In all of their recorded preaching in the book of Acts, they never say the tomb was empty. We saw the empty tomb. They never do. Because the empty tomb didn't convince them. It wouldn't convince their audience. And I think here's something else that's been missed by the people who go with this minimal facts approach. If the majority of liberal scholars accept that the tomb is empty, I don't think they do, but if they do so precisely because it does not necessitate belief in the resurrection. How is that fact overlooked?
You said you discussed 4 bad arguments for the resurrection. What is the 4th?
The 4th goes something like this. All the gospel books testify that the first witnesses to the risen Jesus were women. And no one at that time would have made up such a thing because women were considered unreliable witnesses. Now, this claim is usually accompanied by some illustration of how unacceptable their testimony was. For example, 3 women's testimonies were considered equal to 1 man's testimony, or their testimony in a court of law was considered worthless, or women were not allowed to testify in a court of law. They were considered unreliable witnesses. Or women's testimony was regarded as so worthless that they weren't even allowed to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. Or even if a man was accused of a crime that only women witnessed, he could not be convicted on that basis. That sounds really mean and quite sexist. But the apologetic argument goes this way. If women's testimony was considered so unreliable and worthless, someone making up a story about Jesus rising would never make women to be the first witnesses. It would have made their story less believable.
Why do you think it's a bad argument?
Because it's not true. None of it is true.
No, they did not consider women to be bad or unreliable witnesses in those days.
Absolutely not. And remember, to be bulletproof, it is incumbent on apologists to check and verify any claim that they're going to make and pass on. And this one just does not pass that test.
How so?
First, there is no evidence to support these claims anywhere in the Bible. The law given through Moses makes no injunction against the testimony of women. Second, there's no evidence in any pre-Talmudic source to support the claims. Third, when we do get to the Talmud, we find various rabbis debating various issues, including this one. And the general agreement among them is that women can certainly testify even in court. In fact, the Mishnah, part of the Talmud, gives a list of people who are not eligible to testify, and women are not on that list. Where there are exceptions to their eligibility to testify, they're never based on the idea that women were unreliable witnesses. Furthermore, the same held in the Roman world. Both Jewish society and Roman society considered it unseemly for women to have to go to court to testify, but it was certainly done. Even more important, there's a world of difference between giving testimony in a legal proceeding for which there were rules and guidelines, and simply giving testimony in informal, everyday settings of things one has personally seen and heard. They were not considered unreliable or inferior to men in such cases. A case in point, the famous first century Jewish historian Josephus. He said that women should not testify in court because of what he called the levity and temerity of their gender, but outside of the courtroom, he was quite happy to accept their testimony. His sources, for example, for his account in the wars of the Jews of the siege and battle of Masada, were 2 women. He had no male sources, only women. It was the same for his account of what happened at Gamala, 2 other women, no men, and he was quite happy to accept their testimony on these historical events and include them in his book.
Well, that's interesting. So are you saying that women's testimony in those days carry as much weight as men's?
Absolutely. There's no reason otherwise. Those quotes that I read at the beginning of this discussion on this argument, I don't understand where they came from. None of it is based on any sort of historical reality. But what I find particularly troubling here is that one does not even need to do the historical research to find this out. He should notice it just from the New Testament itself. Consider, for example, the account of the Samaritan woman Jesus meets at Sychar in John 4. Jesus reveals himself to be the Messiah, and then what happens? From verse 28 on, the woman then left her water pot, went her way into the city, and said to the men, "Come, see a man who told me all things that I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" Then they went out of the city and came to him. And then verse 39, and many of the Samaritans of that city believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified. He told me all that I ever did. So here's a whole bunch of people in the city actually believing in Jesus because of the testimony of this one woman. This one what? Woman. Nobody's there saying, oh, her testimony's unreliable. Oh, she's a woman. Oh, we can't believe her. Her testimony's worth 1/3 of a man, or any of that kind of nonsense. They actually came to Christ because of the testimony of this woman. Does that make it sound like a woman's testimony was not believed?
No.
How about this one from John chapter 9? This one's particularly interesting because in this case, we actually have an equivalent of a court situation, a quasi-judicial inquiry. And this is the account of the man born blind in John chapter 9. Once he's born blind, he has this run-in with the Pharisees because they see him doing work on the Sabbath. And we read this: they brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees, and they start asking him questions. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." And some more back and forth. And then we read, but the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees, we do not know." Now, understand, because this is important, this is a quasi-judicial inquiry by the Pharisees. By the law of Moses, the legal standard is you need 2 or 3 witnesses. 2 is the minimum. And they call 2. They have the father and mother here, the obvious ones that you would call as witnesses. To make it valid, you need 2 witnesses. And we can be quite sure that his mother was a woman. Minimum 2 witnesses, the father and mother, and minimum 2 includes one being a woman, and it's perfectly valid. And it really makes me wonder how often evangelicals read this passage and yet blithely continue to aver that the testimony of women was not accepted.
I see what you mean about these not being good arguments. And you're right. We should not be using them.
Exactly. Once again, we want to be bulletproof. We do not want to use arguments that skeptics can debunk. And we do want to be honest. But do note and remember that the fact that these are not good arguments really doesn't matter because we have plenty of good arguments. The 7 arguments I discussed in other programs is more than enough to prove the truth of Jesus' resurrection from the dead.
Can you list those again?
Sure. Number 1 was the eyewitness testimony, that the people telling us that Jesus rose from the dead are people who are in a position to know because they were eyewitnesses. 2 of the gospel writers were eyewitnesses. The 3rd was an eyewitness writing through an agent, and the 4th had received direct eyewitness testimony. Best argument number 2, the early dates of the gospel books. They were written very early, long before any kind of legendary accretions or developments could have crept in, and at a time when there were plenty of eyewitnesses still around to debunk any false claim they might make. The 3rd best argument was the nature of the Christian message. When people make up a message for nefarious purposes, they make up messages that lead to them getting power or money or some such thing. They don't make up a message saying, turn the other cheek, love your enemy, suffer for my sake, they will hate you, they will kill you. It's not the kind of message you make up, and you certainly don't die for such a message. Number 4, the testimony of Josephus. We pointed out that this man, who as far as we know was not a Christian, but was the greatest historian of the first century, did write about Jesus and did affirm that most of the details about him, he was the Christ, he was foretold in the prophecies, he worked miracles, he made many followers, both Jewish and Gentile. He was put to death by the leadership of the place, but his followers didn't abandon him because he appeared again alive to them on the third day. Best argument number 5, the conversion of the Jews in Jerusalem. Again, something that's often overlooked. But the fact that Jews who were trained from birth not to bow the knee and call Lord anyone other than God were doing that for Jesus, thousands and thousands in very short order. What else could explain that other than the resurrection of Jesus? Number 6 was the eyewitness challenge in 1 Corinthians, where Paul's writing to the Corinthians, hammering down on the resurrection and pointing out that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people, the majority of whom are still alive. And it was essentially a challenge. Look, if you don't believe or you're not sure, go and check with them. And as we pointed out, they certainly could have and would have checked. And if the eyewitnesses had not backed up what Paul said, Christianity would have died immediately. It would never have gotten off the ground. And yet here it is. And finally, the 7th one was the apostolic claim that Jesus had risen and had been seen by them. And that one at first doesn't sound like a very good argument. But when you think about it, it is, because no other religious leader ever made that kind of claim. It's not a claim you make unless you can back it up, because you discredit your movement immediately. Not the followers of Buddha or Krishna or Muhammad or Joseph Smith or any of them ever dare to say that their leader had risen from the dead, because to do so would require the ability to produce numerous eyewitnesses right away. And unless somebody actually rose from the dead, you don't have those eyewitnesses. So the fact that no other religious leader's followers ever made the claim, only Jesus' followers did, and they backed it up with the evidence, is again another powerful argument for the truth of the resurrection. So those are our 7 best arguments. We've now seen 4 that are not good arguments. We don't need them. We've got these 7.
Thank you, John, for summarizing. That was very useful, just to rehash all the good arguments so that we can remember them. And if we don't, we can go to Truth in My Days Ministry website and see them listed and explained again, correct?
Exactly. Thank you for sitting in today, Dr. Torres.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.